We put the brand new DJI Osmo Action up against the GoPro HERO7. Is there gonna be a new king in action cam wonderland? Find out in this direct comparison. Now we're here in our studio with our action cam expert Gunther, who has tested a lot of GoPros for us in the past and other action cams. And you also took the Osmo Action for a spin.
Yes, absolutely.
But before we talk about what you actually did and how you compared them, let's formulate what we're actually expecting from action cams in 2019.
Absolutely, yeah. For me, an action cam has to be small, it has to be light. The build quality needs to be very good, top-notch, because you're sometimes outside in very harsh conditions.
It needs to be very rugged as well and resistant.
Absolutely, yes. The auto features of such a cam have to be very advanced because you have constantly changing light conditions. So the auto exposure, the auto white balance is something that needs to work very well on an action cam.
In very many ways, it needs to be smarter than a big professional camera because it needs to adjust to changing lighting conditions all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you need to be able to rely on it to not underexpose or overexpose all the time, which the first few GoPros did.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely right, yeah. And then you also expect a nice and pleasing image out of the box, sort of. You expect a flat picture profile where you can adjust in the post-production process a little bit.
Yeah, and also cut it with other cameras.
Absolutely.
Higher-end cameras. Then the advanced features, I think, are high frame rates. We all want slow motion in many of those action scenes. So this has become a feature that everybody's expecting. And last but not least, I think the image stabilization is something that is very, very important with these cameras because they move so much. I mean, they basically, ideally, this should be like a gimbal on your body or wherever you put it.
Absolutely, absolutely. For instance, in the action scenes that you're going to see, I used a harness, a chest harness, and mounted the cams on the chest harness. And there you see, when you go through rugged terrain, this image stabilization comes in very handy.
Actually, let's take a look at what you filmed with the Osmo Action before we go into comparing the GoPro HERO7 with the Osmo Action.
Good morning, guys. This is Gunther speaking. Today I'm testing the new DJI Osmo Action camera. And as you can see, I'm going to take out my mountain bike with it and do some action sequences.
Okay, Gunther, so now the question is, does the Osmo Action tick all our boxes? Is it actually dethroning the king of action cams, the HERO7? What do you think? I mean, they look very similar from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see, you almost can't distinguish them in terms of size, weight. The Osmo fits very well into the GoPro ecosystem, which is a very good thing, but it has some advanced features.
Yeah, I mean, what's nice about, first of all, let's talk about the exterior. Of course, they are very similar in size, almost the same. What's striking is that the Osmo Action has a large front screen, which also doubles as, you can actually use it for, you can see yourself. I mean, this screen here only shows additional information like the settings, but this is a color screen. So when you double tap here with 2 fingers, let me try that again, then it actually shows you the front of what you're seeing. So you can film yourself, which is very handy, right?
Yeah, that's a very good feature because normally you set up these action cams in very tight spaces and then you cannot see the back screen. Of course, you have an app where you can see also the image, but to have this front screen is a very nice feature actually.
That's a very nice addition. Other than that, it looks very similar. I mean, what's also obvious is that the back screen is quite considerably larger. I think this is a 2.25 inch screen here and it's 16 by 9, whereas the one on the GoPro is a 4x3, which means you basically have bars up and down and you don't have that here. So you're actually using a lot more screen real estate on this camera. But other than that, yeah, you're right. I think what's nice is that it uses the same ecosystem of mounts. So basically what DJI made really smart, you could switch to the Osmo Action tomorrow if you have a lot of GoPro accessories and you would be able to use all your mounts. So that's a very smart move from DJI.
There's one thing maybe we should mention is that there's now already a lot of, or there are now actually a lot of aftermarket ND filters, for instance, available for the HERO7.
True.
And the front lens has changed, but I'm pretty sure that DJI will come very soon with retrofit.
I'm actually sure that the moment people watching this video, there are already ND filters in the DJI store for this particular new lens mount. This can just simply be taken off by unscrewing it here. And I'm sure there will be replacements for this to put ND filters in. It's much easier to take off than the GoPro lenses, which is very, very hard.
You typically break your fingers trying to unscrew this filter.
Yeah, they kind of had to make it so it's still waterproof, I think, but it makes it very hard.
Yeah, basically what I did, I put both cameras to test. I mounted them side by side using 2 chest harnesses.
Next to each other?
Next to each other, actually on top of each other, yeah. And what I did there, I wanted to test how well the electronic image stabilization fares on both cams. What I immediately noticed is that the Osmo without image stabilization already has slightly less wide angle than the GoPro, which is okay. I mean,
so even when the stabilization is switched off, it's less wide angle.
It's wide angle, absolutely. And then if you switch on the electronic image stabilization, which is called Rock Steady with the Osmo, and it's called Hyper Smooth with the GoPro HERO7, you can see that the Osmo crops into the image even more than the HERO7, which is not in all cases a disadvantage. It can be quite good actually.
Yeah, sometimes these cameras are too wide.
Actually, yeah, absolutely right. Sometimes these cameras are too wide. But on the mountain bike, especially if you use a chest harness, you want to have the handlebar in the image because it gives a nice foreground where you can see how rough the terrain is. And then on the chesty, this was not enough wide angle to always cover the handlebar in the footage.
Yeah, we can clearly see it in the footage.
Yes, absolutely. But what I have to say, the electronic image stabilization, so Rock Steady beats Hyper Smooth.
It's even better than Hyper Smooth?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
It's even better than Hyper Smooth, which is really fantastic. So it works absolutely amazingly well.
That is very impressive because that was the one USP that a GoPro had for the HERO7 over the HERO6, which is practically the same image, was the Hyper Smooth that was introduced with this camera. So if you're saying that this is something that DJI does better out of the box, coming from nowhere with their first action cam, that's actually quite impressive.
Yeah, that's a very impressive feature, I have to say. Yeah, then if we start to compare other things, like for instance the auto exposure or the auto white balance, what I noticed is I shot on the DJI Osmo with the Cine-like D profile. And what I typically do is, because when you are on the mountain bike, you move into a forest and then you move into open space, that I try to reduce the exposure a little bit. So on the HERO7, I've used minus 0.5 in the auto exposure, and on the DJI Osmo minus 0.5 was not available, so I used minus 0.7 to retain some of the highlights. But what I found generally in the auto exposure, that in Cine-like D, the image becomes very dark sometimes.
We have to add one thing here. A lot of people will say, why did you not use the HDR for this? Well, very simple. HDR is not supporting the rock steady stabilization in the Osmo Action. And it also increases the rolling shutter effects quite significantly, which is why we tested it, or you tested it, with without HDR, but with rock steady on.
Absolutely, yeah. Also, it's not available in the higher frame rate modes. The maximum we can go is 4K 30 frames per second with the HDR mode, exactly. And we filmed this mountain bike segment with 4K 50 frames per second, 4K 25, and then the high frame rate modes for slow motion.
Yeah. So what were your observations in terms of image? How does it compare the auto exposure from the GoPro HERO7 and the Osmo Action?
The auto exposure basically does not work as well as on the GoPro because it sometimes makes the image quite dark. It seems to have a lot of highlight priority, which means it retains the highlights, yes, but sometimes the image just becomes too dark.
So all the shadows are underexposed. Yes, if you have a high, like bright sky in the background, and something in the front is in the shadows, it might be underexposed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, what you see is that there's no option, at least at now, with the current firmware, that you can reduce the sharpening inside the camera. So the image in general looks a little bit over sharpened, very harsh. It has a lot of micro contrast. So the image is in general not so pleasing like the GoPro image.
Yeah. We're talking particularly about the Cine-like D here, which you used on the Osmo Action to retain as high as dynamic range as possible, and the Pro-tuned flat on the HERO7, which is important to note. Because I think as soon as you switch to the standard mode, you have pleasing colors again, all that, but you of course lose dynamic range.
Of course.
And I think, I mean, this observation you had with the D Cine-like is something that I also had on the original Mavic Pro. Also the sharpening that you mentioned, which was the original Mavic Pro had quite a low 60 megabits per second bitrate, which of course is not a lot for 4K. I mean, this has more, it's 100 megabit, but it still has this kind of sharp look. With the Mavic Pro version 1, you were able to change the sharpening though, to kind of counteract that a little bit. We have not found any way to change the sharpening in the Osmo Action right now, but it looks like this is something that DJI hopefully can implement with a software update, because it would be a shame really if they didn't give you the option to do that, because I think this is one of the, right now what we're seeing, biggest downsides of the camera, that the image is just a little bit over sharpened.
Absolutely. Yeah. Also what you mentioned, it reminds me a lot on the original DJI Mavic Pro camera on the drone. And also what you find there in the DJI Osmo Action camera is that this bitrate of 100 megabit per second in H.264 is simply not enough. You see a lot of macro blocking if you look at these comparison shots. Also noise is something.
The question is if it's not enough. I mean, a lot of DJI engineers, if they're watching this, will be like, oh God, they are always asking for more, because we asked for more from the Mavic Pro when it had 60 megabits per second in 4K, which is of course very low. And now we have 100 and it's still too low for a lot of things. But the thing is, you have to deal with the main competitor in the field, which is the HERO7, which uses H.265 compression, and H.265 compression is a lot more efficient in its top mode. So it's only 75 megabits per second, but it is a lot more efficient, and you can just see that it just fares better, with everything in terms of image compression.
Absolutely. If you look at the colors of the Cine-like D, and as you mentioned, the colors are also out of the box not so pleasing like GoPro. I think GoPro has a lot of improvements. GoPro had a lot of improvements in their recent models with the color science.
They've come a long way from the early GoPros. Look, the image in the early GoPros looked absolutely horrible. So I mean, they've come a really, really long way, and I think that's one of the advantages of the Hero 6 and 7, that the image is so nice.
Absolutely. Yeah, another thing that is very important for action cams, as we mentioned, is the high frame rate modes. Both cams top out at full HD 240 frames per second. For both cameras, this full HD 240 frames per second mode is not so nice. It is quite pixelated, but I have to say on the DJI Osmo Action, it's even more pixelated. It's again this very sharp, over-sharpened look.
Which might have to do with the picture profile. I mean, maybe because there is so much contrast.
The micro contrast
makes it more apparent as well, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure about that.
So we can see it in this slow motion shot where you're jumping over the camera, actually. That is a lot
in the sky, there's a lot of macro blocking going on. And also, if you look at hard edges, hard contrasty edges, you see more pixelation in this full HD 240 frames per second mode.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the catch-22 of the Osmo Action, that the image actually becomes very pleasing again as soon as you switch to the HDR mode. But what's frustrating is that you suddenly don't have the stabilization available anymore, and only limited frame rates. So that's kind of like, you have to decide, do I want to have a really nice image or do I want to have a really steady image? And that's something that will be difficult in some situations. So basically, for every static scene, you would switch to HDR.
Absolutely.
And for every moving scene, you switch back to Cine-like D.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, the HDR, you clearly see, as soon as you switch to HDR, it really is, there's a lot more dynamic range. You see a lot more details in the shadows and the highlights.
Yes.
You can basically point it at anything and see everything.
It's amazing.
And you don't need a flat mode anymore, which is not there in HDR because it doesn't need to be there, of course. So that's nice, but the stabilization is just missing.
Yes.
And what's also apparent, we mentioned it before, is the rolling shutter. If you look at the side by side, the normal video look with the stabilization on versus HDR, which has no stabilization, the rolling shutter is much worse.
Yes.
It's probably because the image, there's always like three images, more processing going on. There's three images that are made into one with HDR. So there's clearly, this actually makes it even less usable for action scenes.
Absolutely.
Even without the stabilization, because there's more rolling shutter.
Yeah, one thing we have to mention though with the DJI Osmo Action is that it has a very nice de-warp feature, which means it removes the typical fisheye look of all these action cameras. And this is nice because it's built in and it completely rectifies this fisheye look. The GoPro HERO7 doesn't have it. Older versions, for those of you who remember it, had this linear mode. And the linear mode
5, right?
on the Hero 5, exactly, there was this linear mode where you could also remove this fisheye look.
But
of course, it goes at the expense.
Anymore.
It's not built in anymore in the Hero 7. And of course, it goes at the expense of cropping in slightly into the image.
Yeah, so you lose some width in your image.
Yes, absolutely.
Again. Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is also something you could do in post-production.
Of course.
But arguably, of course, this is something that a lot of people just simply will not do if it's fast turnaround kind of stuff. So it's nice to have that built into the Osmo Action.
Absolutely.
Well, another very positive note at the end about the Osmo Action is that in Gunther's test, the battery life was considerably better. I think you had quite a bit of juice still left while the GoPro ran out.
Absolutely.
But they have batteries that are almost the same size. I mean, the GoPro battery has only 80 milliampere hours more of juice in there, which is not much. So it's actually interesting that it seems to be doing a better job at power management. But we have to say that it's highly dependent on what kind of frame rate and what kind of image stabilization mode you're using. Same as with the GoPro. So as soon as you switch from 30p to 60p or from 25 to 50p, it will use a lot more power. And it also depends on whether the image stabilization is switched on or not. But in our observation, and we did not compare all the modes for this, but with the same settings on both cameras, the Osmo Action just had a considerably better battery life. And that is a huge advantage.
Absolutely huge advantage. I mean, if you're out there, you have to depend on the camera going on, running. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, we can wrap it up here, I think. I think this is an impressive first action camera from DJI. I mean, if you think back, the GoPro HERO1, we still have one in the drawer here. It looks like something from the Stone Age now, of course, but they did a remarkably good job for the first iteration of their action cam, and I think it's now really GoPro's turn to step it up with the Hero 8. Let's see when that is coming. The only thing is, hopefully DJI can do something about how the image is processed. And also how the auto exposure is working, because we're absolutely, I think we agree here that the Hero 7 does a better job at making sure that everything is exposed pleasantly, to have pleasant colors and stuff like this. So I think there's something that DJI can really enhance. All right, thank you, Gunther.
Great. Yeah. And thanks for having me, and thanks for also having the opportunity to test this new camera on the bike.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And thanks for watching, and stay tuned to Cinema 5D for more reviews. And please also watch the other video where I talk about all the features of the Osmo Action by itself. Thanks for watching.